Hello, my name is Raquel Garcia, and I will be presenting my components of culture presentation that I created for this assignment. So, to begin, I will start by talking about what is culture. Culture is a way of life. It can be defined as the way people interact, dress, eat, and live. And of course, culture is always changing, evolving. Culture is the glue that holds society together. So the seven components of culture from the reading that we were instructed to do, I found were these. Culture is dynamic. Number two, culture is multifaceted. Number three, culture is embedded in context. Number four, culture is influence. Number five, culture is created and constructed. Number six, culture is learned. And number seven, culture is dialectical. So we begin with the first component, which is culture is dynamic. So what this means is that culture is never in a permanent state. It's always changing, it's always evolving, like I mentioned. So one of the examples that I was able to find for this are just inventions. So we can think about the different like generations, millennials versus like Gen Z. I'm a millennial myself, but I work with like the teacher aide that scored like Gen Z. So I often find myself talking about things that I experienced or I encountered growing up as a child, and some of the younger the teacher aides with her they really have no idea what myself and my other coworker are talking about because we're similar in age. So I found this picture, like this image, and it's pretty accurate representation of how inventions have changed our culture, how they have impacted our culture um, from one generation to the next, simply just because of inventions. The invention of the internet, of course, is one that has greatly impacted our culture, our society, um, and so that's one thing that definitely has impacted our culture. Another example of culture is dynamic. I found rights and freedoms. So we see that culture is greatly impacted by laws. Granting freedoms to a nation of people can impact the way they develop and allows culture to flourish. So we can think back on the legalization of like gay marriage a couple of years back. So I think now more so than ever, the LGBTQ that community is a little more open. There's a lot more inclusion in schools, a lot more in books. We can see it in like in the Disney movies. There's like gay partners in commercials, so it's a lot. The that has definitely changed from years before. Um, Another thing that I can think of also is just like rules that they also impact culture. So we can talk about like how businesses in Europe are closed on the weekends, and so this kind of promotes the importance of spending time with family. And so it's very different. The European lifestyle, of course, is more laid back compared to like the American, our American hustle like culture. So that's very different from the lifestyle that we, live and the European culture, the European lifestyle. And of course, this is impacted because of different rules, different rights and freedoms. Okay, moving on to our second component, which is culture is multifaceted. So ethnicity alone is not able to fully define culture. So just because you're Mexican, or just because you're, Native American, just because you speak a certain language, does not, fully define your culture. So one thing that I can think of, or an example, I put here Spanish is the Spanish language. One example is how we speak the Spanish language. I feel that I speak Spanish very fluently, but of course it is very different from a person who speaks Spanish in Latin America or Spain. So just one example that came to mind when I was reading this, talking about how it is multifaceted. my mother was Salvadorian, so a lot of the words that we used in Spanish, they're not common for like Mexican terms or like here in the valley. So I found this image, and it's a very accurate representation of the way I grew up in the Spanish that I learned. Because, and I still remember very specifically going to a restaurant and asking for a pajilla, and the man looked at me with a very strange, like, what are you talking about? What is a pajilla? But I didn't know that here they're called, or in Mexico they're called popotes. And to me, that was odd because I've always called it pajilla. My mom's Salvadorian. We've always just said pajilla. But of course, that's not how it's said. So we can see how our language is not going to be a universal, even though it's the same language. It's not going to be the same from one, area to another. So it doesn't fully define the culture or the language just because you speak a certain language or follow a certain culture. It doesn't generally define. So it's multifaceted. Another example of culture being multifaceted is just here. I feel the RGB itself is a culture in itself. There are many things that make our area unique, I feel. Even though we are considered, most of us are considered Mexican, our culture differs, I think, from like native Mexicans. It is very different. We're in a border town, the way we speak, our Spanglish, our food is different from people who reside or live in Mexico. So I think that that's another example of how culture is multifaceted. Moving on to next component, which is culture is embedded in context. So here I put it. I found it directly from the chapters that we read. Culture is commonly decontextualized. So one example I think is just the American public school system has very greatly decontextualized many different cultures um, by only mentioning, the good parts of its history, or just, completely eliminating like the portions altogether, not even teaching those altogether. So I teach uh, elementary, but I think about, years past when I had just started teaching how, like the crafts that I would do, and I think about them now and how actually how insensitive they were, not actually knowing the history behind like the Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, and in fact, it was actually a massacre that occurred. Same thing with Christopher Columbus, and even myself growing up, learning about Christopher Columbus, and we just learned a little song and talked about the boats, and that was pretty much it. And nothing ever was explained or elaborated upon how the story actually, came about, and how it was actually not a very good story. So a lot of that I think has impacted the way we our culture, the way we grew up thinking about whole, and it kind of gives us this like false sense of thinking that America is the all-time greatest. Not that I'm trying to say it's not, but there's a lot of things that our history, of course, not very good things, and sometimes it's not talked about, and it's important to talk about that, and I think that the public school system's not sometimes doesn't do a very good job, especially with those topics. So it is being decontextualized. So of course, culture is embedded in the context. Another example, I think, where culture is embedded in the context is like how I mentioned earlier, growing up in the valley. It was, at least for me, was uncommon for me to see, grown-ups wearing bikinis when we went to the South Padre Island or to the pool. It was always like t-shirts and shorts, and we grew up with that same notion. When we went to the beach, we had to, t-shirts and shorts. And I don't know if it was because we were religious growing up, but I think a lot of it does have to do with the area in which we live in. So there are a lot of Catholic and Christians in this area, and so it was always very like, okay, a little more modest, like don't show. And so I still remember in high school, and I met a friend who was not from here, was from California, and she was wondering, why do we wear this to the beach? Like, well, I've gone to the beaches here. Why are people always wearing t-shirts? And I didn't think anything of it because I always grew up thinking that was the normal, that was the norm. You wear t-shirts and shorts to the beach and to the pool because that's just how we grew up, and that's the I think the valley culture. That's just how we grew up, and that's the context in which we grew up. So it's kind of like normal. And I remember calling it the RGB bathing suit. That's what we used to call it. Um, so that's just another example of how culture is embedded within context. Um, Moving on to the next component, which is culture is influenced. So culture is influenced by social, economic, and political factors. But I think one like very dominant way that culture is being influenced right now is by social media. And so the biggest thing that came to mind was TikTok. And of course, I downloaded TikTok back in 2020 when we were all in quarantine because no one had anything else to do. And so it really has, I feel, in greatly impacted the way that I think there's like two subgroups: people who use it and people who don't use it. And people who use it kind of have their own like inside jokes. They know the songs. They know a bunch of different things because they're on the app, and versus people who don't. And I think that is a big issue. There was even a couple of I think it might have been last year. It was like an ad for like Coca-Cola or something, but it was one of the TikTok trends. And so it was like that's just how impactful this app has been. I feel like this where it really has dominated, and it really has impacted culture. I think in and I don't know if it's good or bad, but it really has impacted our culture. So another way that culture is influenced, we talk about how it can be influenced by social, economic, and political. So here I talk about economic and the political factor. So money and class, of course, play a big role in culture. So the author that we were reading, the author Sonia Nieto, describes a scenario where let's say that the working class African Americans were now to become the esteemed social group in the U.S. How would that shift the balance? And so, of course, for a long time we have seen whites as the superior race. Media has made it evident. Cartoons, movies, books, TV shows. They have predominantly white protagonists, and I think that's just what we as a society have felt is the esteemed social whites. And so I think of course that has played a very big influence in the way that we see our culture. Maybe sometimes even ashamed of not being white. I know I grew up feeling kind of um, embarrassed, of my own culture because I wanted to be the superior group, which was the white group. So of course that has a lot to do with the way we grow up. Moving on to the next, which brings us, to our next point. Culture is created and socially constructed. So here I talk about race. Of course, I put a little image here. It says historically humans have separated and grouped those with different skin colors and features, which of course happened many years ago. And it's still happening now, maybe not as evident or as it wasn't, or as harsh as it was in the past. Of course, it's still happening. History has created a social construct that white people are superior. And although this has changed, evidence of separation, of course, still remains, and it greatly impacts culture and society. And I see it when I teach my younger students when we talk about race when we talk about skin color, and they're comparing each other's skin to see who's whiter and who's darker, and it kind of goes back, I think, to how they might see, the princess is like a white princess, or it's a beautiful, blonde haired, like blue eyed, um, princess, and so the girls they lean towards that. They want that. Of And I think in the last couple of years, of course, a lot of that has changed because now it's a lot of like black girls, black princesses. They're making, movies like remakes of The Little Mermaid is coming out, and now she's a black mermaid. And so that has impacted, I think, society in a very positive way, I think. Like we mentioned before, it's constantly changing and evolving. And I think in this case, it's for the better. So another way culture is socially constructed, we talk about gender. So the way genders are seen now is very different from just a couple of years ago. So gender norms, of course, have shifted from what was socially acceptable. So now there are we can see that there's gender neutral and all inclusive bathrooms. Where before it was just men and women, and I think maybe it's not so much seen here where we live because, like I mentioned before, I feel like the RGB has its own culture in itself, and I think um, our our culture here might be a little bit more. I don't want to say closed-minded, but I think it's just a little bit more uh, liberal in other places than it is here. And I mean, I have nothing against any of that, but I think it is very different. But I think that it of course is shifting from what was going on years ago. So gender is a big thing that has changed, I think. Um, Next component is culture is learned. Culture is not inherited or passed down. So one example that I think is that I can see here is like classroom culture. So one thing that comes to mind is like norms and expectations from one classroom can differ greatly from another classroom. So actually, this reminds me, and this is why I put it here because I just got two new students the same day last Thursday. On that same day, I got two new boys, um, and one of them is coming from within the district. So he had previously been in school within the same school district, the same grade level. So I thought he might be, a little bit more familiarized with the way the classroom runs, like the things that they might be doing. But it seems as though he has never been in school. And I think the classroom culture, like that I am trying to introduce him to, is completely different from the classroom culture where he's coming from. So it impacts, the way that he learns, the way that he works, the way that he interacts with other children, because they're just so different. And they're within the same school district, the same area. It's not like he's coming from out of the city. Like it's the same, maybe just a couple blocks down, and it's just so different from one classroom to the next. So I see that now. So now I have to teach this child the expectations in the classroom, how like what it is that I want him to do here, what it is that I want him to do next, because it's learned. It's not something that is inherited or passed down. Another way that culture is learned is in the chapters that we read. The author provides an example of a Korean-born child raised in European America. And so she explains that the child will racially and ethnically be Korean, but culturally, the child is going to be European American. So this reminded me of this TV show that I like to watch, Modern Family. So we have Mitch and Cam, and they adopt their daughter Lily, and she is Vietnamese, but they raise her in the American culture and the American lifestyle. So even though she is ethnically, Vietnamese, culturally she's American because that's how they're raising her. They live in California. She goes to school there. She speaks English. The food they eat is not Vietnamese, So although ethnically she is Vietnamese, culturally she's American. So that's just how another example of how culture is learned. Which brings us next to our next point, and I believe this is our final point, which is culture is dialectical. So culture is neither good or bad. And so what this comes to say is that culture changes as society decides what they want to keep and what they want to remove from culture that has been practiced in their families for generations. So one example I can think of are gender roles. So growing up, um, with more traditional parents, it was always like mom was the stay-at-home mom, dad was the breadwinner, mom was the housekeeper, mom was cleaning, mom was taking care of the kids, and dad was working, and that was dad's job. And so the gender roles are that was the standard. That's what I was taught to believe were the traditional gender roles in my culture. But I can see now that of course that has changed for me because I not because not because the gender roles have changed, but because I have decided that that is not the that is not what I want to keep from my culture, and now and I'm sure others see it the same way. So now we have more non-traditional roles where the dad can be a stay-at-home dad. A man can dress up as a bride if he chooses so. A woman can work in construction, and the traditional gender roles that we have come to know in our culture now have shifted because we've decided that that's what we want. So that's an example of how culture is dialectical. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dialectical. So the last example is how it's dialectical. So I actually have three three cultures because I am born in the United States, which makes me American. My father is native from Monterrey, and my mother is Salvadorian. So I actually grew up with those three cultures. Um, so in the people's whose cultures are minimized by society sometimes feel that they have to accept either one culture or the other, and there's no in between. So, of course, growing up, I fell, victim of that, and it was hard because either I spoke English and my native language. Going into school, I only spoke Spanish, but it was kind of I picked up the English language rather quickly through TV, reading. I picked it up fairly quickly, but I was almost embarrassed to admit that I knew Spanish. I didn't want to. I wanted to be American, just like I wanted to speak English and I wanted to watch SpongeBob SquarePants, and eat pizza and do everything that the American kids were doing, and so. But then we would go and visit my cousins in Reynosa, in Monterrey, and then I felt out of place because they would call me Picha and I didn't know how to say certain things in Spanish, and but I wanted to fit in with them and I wanted to eat tacos and I wanted to pay with pesos and I didn't know how to count the money. And so then my relatives from Houston would come down, which is from my mom's side, and they were speaking Spanish completely different and saying words that I didn't understand because the Salvadorian culture is very different from the Mexican culture. And so I was torn between those three. And of course, um, that was very hard for me. It was like, well, which culture is it? So now, of course, I've learned to embrace all three. But growing up, it was rather tough as a child, just because I felt like I either had to accept one culture or the other, um, and there was no in between. Thankfully, that has changed, and now I'm able to embrace all three. And I think now, compared to how it was when I grew up, kids nowadays or the younger generations are more accepting of that different cultures. They try to pronounce, foreign names correctly, things like that. And it's happened to me before where, or I've heard it where in high school and they cannot pronounce the name. Oh, well, I'm just going to call you, whatever. And that's very disrespectful. And I think a lot of that has affected the way we grew up and almost being ashamed of our culture. But I'm glad things are changing now. I'm glad things have shifted for the better. So I'm going to end my presentation with this quote from Mahatma Gandhi. It says, "A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people." And I thought that was very beautiful. Um, so that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much.